Hey, what's up, everybody? It's been a while. I think we might have missed 2 Fridays. I've been on the road, and we're back for another Grayzone Live. We're going to try to cover some of the bigger stories that we might have missed or that we've been covering. Aaron conducted a really important interview with Andre Telesenko, who is a Ukrainian government whistleblower. So we're going to talk about that in the context of what's happening with Hunter Biden and Ukraine in general. I'm at an undisclosed location right now in Nicaragua. I was actually here for the July 19th celebrations, where the Sandinista Front and its supporters come out and celebrate the liberation of the country from the dictator Anastasio Somoza on July 19th, 1979. That was the defeat of the dictatorship. Of course, the U.S. then came in with a dirty war through, activated through the CIA to destroy the Sandinista Front. And they are still working on that with sanctions and other threats. So it's interesting to be back here and to have witnessed that ceremony. And I also, that was on the heels of a few sets with Jimmy Dore up in Baltimore, which if you're lucky, I might post online. Might be working on editing one of those with some highlights, just because I get I've been getting so much interest. Who knows? Maybe it'll be like the fatal blow to whatever's left of my serious veneer as a journalist.
Well, you have a joke about that in your set, right? About how your job is basically like, you could do your bit, but don't you joke about the profession of journalism in your set?
Yeah, I just say it's appropriate I'm doing comedy because my profession's a fucking joke. Whoever takes himself seriously as a journalist at this point just is a clown. But anyway, I see you're kind of in a new chair. Where are you?
I'm in California.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
You've been very bi-coastal.
Very bi-coastal. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Well, I advocate, Max, that you upload that set, the edited version, because I think there's some jokes you got to take out just to avoid being in prison. But the edited version, I totally advocate you post. It's a great set. And again, I hope if you have a chance to catch Max and Jimmy live, don't miss it. It's a great time. And Steph too, obviously.
Yeah, maybe I'll show up for one of the New York shows. Just quickly on the Nicaragua front, and happy July 26th to all our people in Cuba who might be watching, or supporters of Cuba's revolution. Nicaragua and Cuba have both suffered enormously under U.S. sanctions. You don't really feel the sanctions here. You get mixed impressions from people about how sanctions are impacting them. Everyone agrees it's causing prices to go higher, and the cost of raw material for building and everything is higher. So there definitely is pressure. One of the interesting things about the ceremony was the presence of high-level diplomats from countries that are considered rogue states by Washington, and which we would consider to be simply independent countries taking their own path. So I believe the foreign minister of Belarus was on hand, several diplomats from China, the deputy speaker of the Russian Duma, and honored at the festival was the prime minister of Burkina Faso. We've covered this at the Grayzone. Burkina Faso had a coup, which was celebrated by what appeared to be the majority of its citizens. And there were scenes in the capital of citizens waving Russian flags during this coup. Then the Western media started buzzing about, oh, the Russians are here, the Russians are coming. It turned out one guy in town in Ouagadougou had been making these flags by hand just to make money, because Russia had become so popular, not necessarily because people just love Putin, but because they actually wanted the Wagner group to come in and replace the French to remove Boko Haram and this Al-Qaeda presence that had been terrorizing them. The same exact thing had been happening in Mali. And So they had this popular upsurge. A military junta comes in, led by a guy named Ibrahim Traore, and they start to restore the principles of the revolutionary reformer Thomas Sankara, who was the figure during the late 70s and early 1980s who really developed Burkina Faso, implemented land reform, instituted a literacy program with the help of the Soviet Union and Cuba, brought medical care to the countryside, and increased the literacy rate and lifespan of the Burkinabe people by like more than any other leader had. He was assassinated by a CIA asset in 1986, I believe, who was his former friend and minister, Blaise Compaoré. And the prime minister of Burkina Faso now is a dedicated disciple of Thomas Sankara. Thomas Sankara had met with the Nicaraguan president, Daniel Ortega, during the heyday of the Sandinista revolution. And so this was sort of a rejoining of, or sort of history coming back to haunt the neoliberals who thought that they had kind of taken all of these independent reformist leaders out. And it was so I thought that was significant about the event. It was disappointing, however, that the event was limited to invited attendees, invited guests. So there were maybe 2,000 people on hand, or several thousand. Normally 500,000 people come out into this plaza in the middle of Managua, all the Sandinistas from around the country. I mean, this is a movement of 3 million people. They come out and it's just a popular, gigantic party with fireworks, and to be in the crowd is incredible. People are shooting off these, celebratory mortars just randomly and that wasn't present. I mean, this is partly the legacy of COVID, but there are also security threats. And there are a lot of heavy decisions to be made in Managua, given the looming threat of more sanctions. For example, how much to cast their lot with China, how much to welcome China in, given that the Biden administration, while they may not flaunt it, also have the same Monroeist point of view that John Bolton espoused when he was Trump's chief of staff and tried to overthrow every government of what he called the troika of tyranny, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. The Biden administration sees this as their backyard, and they will see, Belt and Road activities here as a direct threat. So that's what I've seen so far here. And beyond that, life just kind of continues as normal.
And with Nicaragua too, I have to imagine that if you're a neocon in Washington, there's like the added imperative of revenge. Like Nicaragua has been defiant for the last 4 decades, and they've been successful in resisting the U.S. effort to control the country. And so when you look at how people like Elliot Abrams, recently appointed by Biden to some commission on diplomacy or something, the way they talk about Nicaragua, there's a lot of spite. And I have to think that for them too, there's just like, no matter even Nicaragua's place in the world right now and its relationship with China, there's just for them, I'm just speculating here, there's a desire constantly to take revenge on anybody who successfully shows defiance.
There's a desire for revenge, and now they've adopted these opponents of the government here who actually were responsible for this blood-stained coup in 2018, which lasted for 2 months. A coup attempt saw the country completely shut down with roadblocks, killings of Sandinistas across the country, gun battles, all kinds of horrors that I witnessed the aftermath of in July 2018. And what the Biden administration has done is all these figures were thrown in jail because they were taking U.S. money for their NGOs. They were calling for the murder of the president and his family. They were organizing armed gangs, taking them out into the street, tormenting civilians. They reduced Nicaragua's GDP to zero. I mean, if this happened in the U.S., what we saw with January 6th and the crackdown would have been 1,000 times harsher. You would have seen special forces in U.S. cities, definitely the National Guard would have immediately come out. Catholic priests were heavily involved in this. So the Biden administration, what they've done is they've negotiated a deal with Nicaragua where they said, and you can never trust the U.S., as we see with the Minsk Accords or anything, the Oslo Accords. That will kind of lay off you if you just send them to us. Let us take these so-called dissidents, and now they're all getting university positions and being sent around on all these tours to organize another regime change attempt in Nicaragua. And the State Department is encouraging Nicaraguans to immigrate to the U.S. illegally, telling them that they're going to get asylum. And so for the first time, you're seeing some Nicaraguans actually bypass Costa Rica, which is the traditional transit point where they would work, and stay there and then come back to Nicaragua, actually make a run for the northern border. This is so cynical on the part of the Biden administration, and it's a political attack on Nicaragua using migration as a weapon. And they're not getting asylum.
I'm pretty sure the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, did that with Haiti back when they were first trying to overthrow Jean-Bertrand Aristide the first time. And, when Aristide came to power in the first democratic election in Haiti's history, overwhelming grassroots support, there was encouragement, if I remember the history correctly, of Haitian migrants. And then as soon as Aristide was overthrown and a junta came in backed by the U.S., all of a sudden, all of the doors were closed and Haitian migrants were sent back, and there were all these patrols and sent to Guantanamo. That's sort of the origins of Guantanamo. So there's a similar playbook there.
Right. And they sanctioned even defensive weapons like bulletproof vests for Haiti's police, knowing that they were going to start sending armed gangs on the Capitol.
Yeah.
That was done, through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So they would like to do that to Nicaragua, but right now things are very stable here. There's no sign of any support for roadblocks. Again, the opposition is completely crushed, and they've been basically sent to the U.S. I mean, I was joking with some of the Sandinista higher ups when I got to bump into them that I was thanking them for bringing all the coup leaders to my neighborhood, saying, I say hi to him every day as he's watering his lawn. That's not really true. They never live in my neighborhood, but they're in D.C., they're in Miami. They're pushing for another regime change attempt, but I think it will be several years. I need to take a break for about 15 seconds, and I'll be right back.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us as we wait for Max to come back. Remember to like this stream. That helps us defeat algorithmic suppression, and share the stream if you want others to watch it. Today, we're going to talk mostly about Ukraine, the latest in the proxy war there, and also what's happening with Joe Biden as his personal entanglement in Ukraine becomes increasingly impossible to separate from the war there, with Hunter Biden being the subject of now so many disclosures, so many allegations, which we're going to get into very shortly. And it's sort of a lot of what we're seeing with Hunter Biden and Joe Biden is sort of the mirror image of Russiagate, where like the premise of Russiagate was that Donald Trump was accused of being compromised by Russia, of possibly being prone to blackmail, of taking illicit payments. And there was never any evidence for any of that, as we saw from, so many years of investigations. But now you have with Biden and Ukraine so many allegations coming out, and although I don't think there's any smoking gun yet, as was the focus for so long in Russiagate, there are so many damning disclosures that point to serious evidence that are at least worthy of investigation. And we'll get to it now.
So, Aaron, you interviewed this Ukrainian government whistleblower, Andre Telesenko. I'd actually seen him briefly quoted in an incredible documentary series by a French filmmaker called whose website is called Le Crisse, LES-CRISES, I think .fr, and it's about Biden and the general prosecutor of Ukraine and the corruption around Burisma. And then Garland Nixon featured him, and then you had him for, I thought, the ultimate interview, really drawing everything he knew out about Maidan, which he apparently was heavily involved in, all the way up to the Ukraine proxy war. So who is Andre Telesenko and why is he so significant?
He is a former Ukrainian official who worked in Ukraine's government before the 2014 Maidan coup and afterward. And he witnessed what he says was basically a huge U.S. role, not only in the coup, but also in the post-coup government, to the point where the U.S. was deciding who could be hired and who couldn't inside Ukraine. And he's very critical of the Bidens. He's very critical of Zelensky for running on a peace mandate that he personally himself believed in. But then he says Zelensky basically sold out under pressure from the West, including especially the US and UK. And he made a lot of really important claims in our interview. Let's just go to one. So here he is talking to me about what he witnessed, what he says he witnessed after the Maidan coup and the strong U.S. role in the post-coup government.
Of full control. The Ukrainian government became, within the 9 years of after the coup of 2014, fully controlled by the U.S. government and by the G7 ambassadors.
So just in case you have a hard time hearing that, he says the U.S. government took full control of the Ukrainian government after the 2014 coup.
When we came to work in the cabinet of ministers of Ukraine, and in my first government position as an advisor to the first deputy prime minister, we had meetings with the CIA director Brennan, for example, and I was told who we were going to meet, but my boss did not know who could meet. The U.S. embassy told me not to inform the first deputy prime minister who he's going to meet because he's not trustworthy. He can leak this information. So from small things like that, telling us what to do, to big things like telling us who to fire, who to hire, what department to cut, what department to inform, what department to bring more money in.
So just to clarify that in case people have a hard time hearing it, because the sound wasn't great. He says that the U.S. told Ukrainian officials who they could hire for key positions and even what programs or departments they should cut.
Things would be set in motion, and if it not, the middle process would not listen to those issues. They would go to the president directly or to the prime minister, and then he would give an order directly to people to hire, to fire, to send more money, and basically they would control everything. They would start the destruction of the Ukrainian bureaucracy and the administrative machine. That's which I started to witness, and I went against. In 2017, when this process led to changes where we saw the unprofessionalism of the Ukrainian police, unprofessionalism of the Ukrainian prosecutor's office, when we had foreigners walking around the government buildings and were placed in positions where they were not supposed to be placed with clear and full security clearance in the Ukrainian government, foreigners without even a Ukrainian passport were put in place and giving orders to not knowing the Ukrainian law, not knowing the Ukrainian language. They would just be there and giving orders and doing what they would have to do.
So what he's describing there is how basically after the Maidan coup in 2014, the West took control of Ukraine's government and, among many things, used it as a proxy against Russia and helped sabotage the Minsk peace accords, which would have ended the war that began after the 2014 coup. And I think set us on the path to what we're in today. And what's interesting about Andre is, so he works for the Ukraine government before and after the coup. Then he goes over to the U.S. embassy in Ukraine, and he says he witnesses an interference effort by Ukrainian embassy officials in trying to undermine the Trump campaign. And we know that it's already been reported in Politico by Kenneth Vogel how Ukrainian officials tried to leak damaging information about Paul Manafort to get him fired because they wanted Hillary Clinton to win, because they felt as if Trump might use U.S. leverage to, for example, end the war in the Donbass. But that was happening. And they thought Hillary Clinton was a better bet for their agenda, which I think is a fair assessment. And then he goes on to work for Blue Star Strategies, which is the U.S.-based firm that was hired by Burisma, which is the energy company that hired Hunter Biden and gave him a very lucrative board seat, and is now at the center of so many more disclosures, because among the things that have happened in recent weeks is the FBI, under congressional pressure after resisting this for a long time, finally released this interview form with a long time and apparently very trusted confidential human source who alleges that the founder of Burisma, this guy Zlochevsky, paid millions of dollars in bribes to the Bidens to have the prosecutor, Victor Shokin, who was investigating Burisma, had to have him fired. And this is among a series of claims made by this source. Now, these allegations are not confirmed, but what we do know is what is public. And what is public is already pretty damning. After the 2014 coup, Biden becomes the most influential U.S. politician inside of Ukraine. He's going over there for meetings. He's talking often to Poroshenko, the president. And around that time, Hunter Biden gets hired for this very lucrative board seat. And in the confidential human sources talks to the FBI, he says that Burisma executives admitted that they hired Hunter Biden to take care of this prosecutor Shokin. And indeed, this prosecutor Shokin was fired after Joe Biden threatened to withhold loan guarantees to Ukraine.
Yeah, let's read from this document a little bit. The confidential human source was claimed to be in Vienna, Austria, around the same time that Biden was denouncing Shokin as corrupt. And Shokin had also been facing assassination attempts. There were snipers who fired into his office around this time. And according to the CHS, the confidential human source, it would have a negative effect. The confidential human source told Mikhailo Zlochevsky, the owner of Burisma, that it would have a very negative effect on Burisma's IPO in the United States if he remained under investigation by Victor Shokin. Victor Shokin, by the way, is considered a very professional prosecutor in Ukraine, had opened more investigations than any of his predecessors. And according to this document, Zlochevsky replied, "Don't worry, Hunter will take care of all those issues through his dad." Zlochevsky also said when he was approached by the human source and told to hire professional oil experts in the U.S. to start working on these issues, professional industry lobbyists instead of Hunter Biden, he said, and that payments to the Bidens would cause him trouble. He said, everything will be okay because this thing will go away. It was too late to change the decision, even though he acknowledged that Hunter Biden, quote, was stupid and Zlochevsky's dog was smarter than Hunter Biden. He needed him on the board so everything would be okay. And then there's this kind of key takeaway there about the CHS warning Zlochevsky about giving $500,000 to Hunter Biden. And then he says something to the effect of, I already gave $5 to both. It cost $5 million to pay one Biden and $5 million to another Biden. We can't confirm any payments there. That's just the confidential human source talking, but he's claiming that he paid the guy who's referred to the big guy in this document. It's I wouldn't say it's damning stuff, but it dovetails with everything we know on the public record about what actually happened with the prosecutor, as you were saying, Aaron.
Yeah, and here's Biden himself bragging in public about how he got the prosecutor fired.
I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting $1 billion. I said, you're not getting $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here in about 6 hours. I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they fired who was solid. And I was going.
So, yeah, go ahead.
And meanwhile, the official Joe Biden explanation as to why Hunter Biden would get such a lucrative board seat on Burisma, $80,000 a month, even though he has no energy sector experience whatsoever. And this is shortly after his father becomes the most influential person in Ukraine, aside from Ukraine's president. The official explanation from Joe Biden is simply that his son, Hunter Biden, is really bright, is a really bright guy. That's literally what Joe Biden has said. So this is, for example, Joe Biden speaking during the 2020 campaign.
Do you think it was wrong for him to take that position,
No.
knowing that it was really because that company wanted access to you?
Well, that's not true. You're saying things you do not know what you're talking about. No one said that. Who said that?
Don't
Who
you
said
think that? Don't you think that it's just one of those things where people think, well, that seems kind of sleazy. Why would he have that job if not for who his father was?
Because he's a very bright guy.
I guess the question I'm kind of asking is,
He's a very bright guy. He always been saying, my son did nothing wrong. Okay, I mean, you're his father. You're not going to just trash your son. You have to say that. But to say he's a very bright guy, I mean, there's really no evidence to back that up. And if he was a bright guy, I don't think he would have been engaged in all of these activities, which present the most existential threat to Biden's reelection, I think. And, just going back before we move on, going back to those Council on Foreign Relations comments from 2018. By the way, I watched that live and I remember seeing Biden's decline for the first time. He was really struggling with recall. And I think he was being way too off the cuff there. To his left, to Biden's right, our left is seated Michael Carpenter, who is kind of his post-Maidan administrator of Ukraine, is heavily involved in policy now. And he also was an Atlantic Council fellow at the time. And the Atlantic Council was taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from Burisma. And then Biden turns to his left, our right. And I don't know, is that right? Richard Haas? Yeah. And he says, I put in someone who's solid as prosecutor. In replacing Viktor Shokin, who he was calling corrupt, he put in a guy named Yuri Letsenko, who was not even a lawyer, has no law degree, and had actually been jailed when he was interior minister under the pre-Maidan government because he was involved in so much financial misconduct. And by the way, Zlochevsky also served in that government, the head of Burisma, as environmental minister, because he was in charge of giving all the land titles to all the corrupt gas mafiosi. So the guy he put in was not solid in any way. He was a complete pawn of the U.S., and he proceeded to drop the Burisma investigation while Burisma was paying the employer of Biden's top advisor on Ukraine. I mean, I don't know how they can just play this off as if they didn't do anything.
Yeah. And meanwhile, it's been reported that Devin Archer, who was Hunter Biden's business partner in all this in Ukraine, when they worked together as Western consultants inside Ukraine, that he's going to testify that Joe Biden spoke on the phone on these business phone calls that they had at least 24 times. That's the report from Miranda Devine, who's done a lot of work on this. And again, that's not something that he hasn't testified yet. So maybe that is not what he says. But the point is, you have all these claims coming out, and they're at least worthy of investigation. And the reason we haven't really had a serious discussion of them up to this point is because every time anything has come out, it's just been accused of being Russian propaganda. That's what happened with Hunter Biden's laptop in 2020. And anytime anybody ever tries to talk about this, they get accused of parroting Russia. That's just the classic Russiagate playbook. So that guest who I interviewed, Andre, this former Ukrainian official, he's sanctioned by the U.S. government. And he was sanctioned right when he was trying to come forward with the claims that he's making now in interviews with people like me. He was sanctioned by the Treasury Department for trying to improperly influence an election, which is just the Russiagate playbook now. Anybody who is trying to raise concerns about corruption, especially if it's like a neocon favored candidate, like in the case of Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden, they get accused of spreading Russian propaganda. And fundamentally, that's what all this is about. This isn't for me about the personal corruption of the Bidens, which, that's very boilerplate in Washington. It's not out of the ordinary. This is about how the U.S. has used Ukraine for its own ends, and not just for corrupt dealings that benefit people like Hunter Biden, but ultimately to turn it into a NATO proxy. And that drive right there and that process is, I think, a major cause of the war we're seeing right now. It's the point where, remember when Trump got impeached the first time because he asked Zelensky to look into corruption allegations surrounding Joe Biden at the same time as he froze weapons sales to Ukraine. He was impeached for that. And up on the House floor, that led Adam Schiff to say stuff like this.
The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here.
So when Adam Schiff was saying that, liberals applauded because it was in the process of impeaching Trump. And because this was all done in the name of combating Trump, everybody looked away at what the actual real world consequences of that were, including normalizing in liberal circles this idea of using Ukraine to fight Russia over there. So the proxy war was going on long before Russia invaded in February 2022. The liberals were incentivized to look away because they were told this was the way to hold Trump accountable and to impeach him. And ultimately, actually, politically, that actually backfired because that first impeachment ended with Trump's highest approval ratings of his entire presidency. And then geopolitically, the consequences are disastrous because instead of putting an end to the fight in Ukraine against Russia, that impeachment helped fuel it, leading us to where we are today.
Would also produce revelations from George Kent, who was at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, that there were concerns even within the embassy about the installation of Yuri Lutsenko as general prosecutor and about his own credentials and ability to actually crack down on corruption. If you really examine the impeachment papers, it's not all about Trump. There's and what we keep hearing now, Aaron, is that all these new allegations about Biden and Burisma, which show Biden being more directly, the big guy being more directly involved than he's claimed, were discredited in the impeachment hearings. Do you think that, I mean, what are they referring to there?
No, they're not. They say that in the same way they say that like Mueller established that Russia interfered in the election when, again, if you look at the actual evidence, he didn't establish anything. In fact, the evidence he produced undermines that allegation, I think. But that's just repeated because that is deemed to be the truth and because it serves a propaganda narrative. So that's what we have to accept as truth. But no, there was no discrediting of these allegations at all. As you mentioned, George Kent, who was like a star witness, he raised concerns about Hunter Biden being hired by Burisma and said this would look really bad. He was basically told to shut up about that. And so there was nothing in the impeachment that discredited the Biden stuff. The whole point of it was to basically turn this into something about Trump and Russia and not look at the actual substance of the Biden controversy.
And Andre Telesenko, who you interviewed, refers to the Ukrainian government as a complete puppet of the U.S. He also says that the Ukraine proxy war was prepared well in advance and everyone was expecting it within that government. This also, I think, reflects on the role of so many people from the Obama administration to the present in everything that's taken place up to this point, including Donald Trump's impeachment. I mean, they were heavily involved in the operation to finesse a whistleblower and to try to punish Trump for seeking to suspend arms shipments to Ukraine. They needed to keep this train going. So what he's saying there, I think, is incredibly significant because he's connecting the corruption around post-Maidan to the Ukraine proxy war.
The so-called whistleblower in the Trump impeachment, the official who first raised concerns about that Trump phone call in July 2019 with Zelensky, the one that got Trump impeached.
Yeah,
his name is Eric Ciamarella, and at the time he was with the CIA. But prior to that, under the Obama administration, he basically was Victoria Nuland's point man in Ukraine. And there, if you look at like what's available publicly from FOIA, from Freedom of Information requests, in terms of emails, Eric Ciamarella was so involved in keeping other Obama administration officials briefed on what was happening inside Ukraine, including, for example, when he came into office and he signed something called the Steinmeier formula, which is basically an attempt to revive and implement the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords being the peace agreement between Russian-backed rebels in Ukraine and the post-coup Ukraine government to end the war. And Ciamarella is briefing Nuland and his colleagues on Zelensky signing this. And a lot of it is redacted, but you can tell if you read between the lines that there was concern about Zelensky signing this because they didn't want there to be peace in Ukraine. They wanted to keep actually using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. They didn't want that war to end. And that's why William Taylor, who was also a star Trump impeachment witness and served as the top U.S. official in Ukraine at the time. He recently told the Washington Post that when Zelensky was talking to him about implementing the Steinmeier formula and the Minsk Accords, Taylor took him aside and said, "Don't do it. You know, it doesn't make any sense. The Germans don't know what they're the Germans being the government that Steinmeier was in. He was the foreign minister of Germany. They don't know what they're doing. Don't do it." So there was pressure on Zelensky not to sign it, and because the U.S. didn't have his back on implementing the Minsk Accords, and in fact they wanted him not to implement it, he couldn't do it because, of course, as we know from whistleblowers like Andre, the guy I interviewed, and others, the U.S. was ultimately calling the shots in Ukraine.
I was flipping through channels like 3 weeks ago, you know, watching CNN, a Ukraine segment on the counteroffensive, which was already failing at that point. And William Taylor, you just mentioned, was on. And another guest said, you know, I don't think we should go as far as to hit Crimea and send the ATACMS missiles to strike inside Russia. And Bill Taylor immediately jumps in and says, send the ATACMS, hit Crimea, do everything. Just looked like a complete fanatic. And by the way, guess what he is now? Where he is? He's the deputy director of the U.S. Institute for Peace. So the U.S. Institute for Peace deputy director is calling for striking Crimea. This was a guy who sabotaged the Minsk Accords. And if you know what the U.S. Institute for Peace is, it's just a soft power appendage of the State Department located directly across the street from the State Department, where a lot of these people cool their heels. Victoria Nuland also had her fingerprints all over the distribution of the Steele dossier. And she was even involved in Russiagate. They were involved in keeping the war train going, or beating the war drums throughout the Trump administration. And when I think back to Lindsey Graham saying on his 2017 visit with John McCain to meet with one of these extreme right battalions, I think it was the Dnipro battalion in Ukraine, and he said 2017 is going to be the year of offense. Sorry, this was 2016. The 2016 election was underway. And he said 2017 will be the year of offense. I think he just assumed Hillary Clinton would win and all these people, there'd be continuity between the Obama administration and the Clinton administration, and Victoria Nuland would just sweep in and the war would begin. So it all goes back to Telesenko's comments that the war was prepared well in advance. Everyone knew it was going to happen. And by the way, congratulations to Victoria Nuland on being elevated to Deputy Secretary of State, replacing Wendy Sherman. This is, happened very quietly, and it's one of the more dangerous developments of the week. Having a fanatic right behind Tony Blinken, not that he's much different, but she's really driving the policy.
William Taylor, going back to him, he also was the guy who, when Obama decided he got cold feet about the proxy war in Ukraine, which he helped start with the Maidan coup, and he wouldn't send weapons over to Ukraine to fuel the fight, resisting everybody in his administration, by the way, including Joe Biden and Antony Blinken. William Taylor described Obama's policy as, quote, appeasement. So what was once a policy of Barack Obama is now considered, beyond the pale. And people like William Taylor, their position that Obama's policy was appeasement, that is now the mainstream. And anybody who questions that, anybody who takes the position of Barack Obama back in 2015, 2016, now they're on the extremes of both parties. I'm not even really at the extreme of the Democrats, because there are no Democrats who oppose the proxy war. It's really only the MAGA Republicans who raise any questions now in Congress. So if you take the position of Barack Obama, according to the mainstream consensus now, you're on the side of appeasement and you're at the extremes. And let's play that Lindsey Graham clip just for anybody who hasn't heard it, because it really foretold everything we've seen since. This is, as Max said, in late 2016.
Your fight is our fight. 2017 will be the year of offense.
It'll be the year of offense.
All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia.
And you will all die. Most of those guys are probably dead or injured right now.
Aggression.
And John McCain's in atheist hell.
I mean, yeah.
Look at those. It's shocking. I mean, so they got their war just 5 years too late. 5 years
Yeah.
later.
Exactly. When Trump briefly impeded it by freezing some weapons, they impeached him.
So this is what happens, when you are located right next door to an official designated enemy of the US and you surrender your country to the US, your society is going to be destroyed.
Yeah.
This is the future that awaits Taiwan. And when I say your society is going to be destroyed, I don't just mean, Russia the bear will be provoked and tempted to come in and smash you with artillery. I mean, your society is going to be ravaged by BlackRock. You're going to be a laboratory for things like the DIA app, this all-encompassing totalitarian digital ID app that's being tested in Ukraine for export abroad. You will also become a baby factory for, upper middle class people in the West. Ukraine has less than 1% of the world's population, and it's responsible for over 20% of surrogate children being carried by poor Ukrainian women because people want a white woman to carry their kid for them. And the company that's responsible for much of it, Biotexcom, was under investigation at one point. And then according to Yuri Letsenko, the general prosecutor installed by Biden, he was given an Untouchables list by another impeachment figure, Marie Yovanovitch. She denies this. He never produced the list. It sounds pretty plausible. Anyway, the investigation into Biotexcom, the surrogate baby farm, which was, it's just inherently responsible for human rights abuses and exploitation. That investigation was dropped. And it's mainly serving people in the US. I don't think the transportation secretary, Pete Buttigieg, necessarily went to Ukraine. He could probably afford to do this in the US, but his children, I believe, are being done through surrogates. We see celebrities doing this all the time. So it's a perfect metaphor for what Ukraine has become. It's carrying babies to term that are then ripped from its womb by wealthier, more powerful people who are exploiting it. And the US ambassador is allegedly coming in and telling the prosecutor who they can and can't prosecute. And the corruption with the Bidens is continuing. We now know who's buying Hunter Biden's art. It's not necessarily an art appreciator. Have we seen, and if you're not familiar, Hunter Biden is an artist. His art is being sold at a high-level LA gallery. And this is a way for people to basically pay the Biden administration and give Hunter Biden a career while currying influence. And it was bought by a pro-Israel Democratic donor friend who Biden named to a prestigious art commission. But we don't have the subscription here. But her name is Elizabeth Hirsch Naftali. She's obsessed with Israel, and she was appointed to a prestigious commission, and she spent 1.3 million. Well, Hunter Biden's artwork has brought in 1.3 million. There's an anonymous donor still who has spent $875,000 on Hunter Biden's artwork, and he's donating some of the proceeds to pay for the life of the 4-year-old love child he had with a woman in Texas, who he has refused to take custody of or provide for. So this is part of the settlement that he had out of court with that woman. So when you have all this going on and Biden is so heavily involved with a foreign government, he's going over there threatening them with loans if they don't do what they want. It's also hard to tell who's influencing whom, because I think, these Maidan figures who are not exactly on the up and up have had influence on Biden as well, the same way that the Israel lobby is able to influence US politicians to take a more hostile line against Iran. We don't know the full extent of it.
Yeah, it's very plausible. If you're Joe Biden and your son has been gifted with this very lucrative position, made a lot of money in Ukraine with no experience, then obviously it's quite plausible to believe that Biden is somehow beholden to some people inside Ukraine. That's just, especially if something illicit happened and they know about it. That was the whole premise of Russiagate. It turned out to be fiction. In this case, there's so many more grounds to believe that there's something to that. And
Yeah.
we can't look at that because any attempt to look at that is constantly dismissed as Russian propaganda. And there's been such an effort, such a coordinated effort to undermine any real scrutiny. And we're seeing the consequences of that now. And of course, this also extends to the reality of the proxy war in Ukraine, which, again, getting some basic facts out to the public has been so difficult. Maybe we can turn to that now, Max, and just give people a brief update on how that's going. Because even as the Biden administration says that Ukraine is winning, Russia is lost, things are not looking good for Ukraine. But just to give you an example of the messaging right now from the Biden.
Well, I want to just, before going to the next segment, just say a few things. And I had a question. Devin Archer, who is Hunter Biden's business partner, is the brother-in-law of one of the Hines children, who is the children of Teresa Hines, who's married to John Kerry. I always get this confused.
Yes. The okay, so they founded Devin Archer and Hunter, they founded Rosamont Seneca Partners with Christopher Hines, who is the son-in-law of John Kerry.
Okay. And Vanessa Carey, who's John Kerry's daughter, was just made climate czar, or given some climate position, and John Kerry was the climate czar. And if you're a climate czar, you probably oppose the burning of methane, coal, the kind of things Burisma was doing. But Devin Archer used Vanessa Carey as a avenue of influence for Burisma. He and his wife hosted a benefit with her weird health company, her nonprofit health company, and they used it, according to emails, to approach her about getting John Kerry to help out Burisma. We don't know what happened there, but this is all just, it all shows the incestuousness of the Biden administration and all of these figures who've been wrapped up in this very real scandal of foreign influence and how they're still being promoted and elevated. So I just wanted to make that point. And I also want to announce something that's coming up that's really important to me and to the Grayzone. And it's that we're going to launch our first fundraiser, just asking for a specific cause, for you to donate to a specific cause, which is for us to actually reward the dedication of our regular contributors, people like Kit Clarenberg, who was recently interrogated by British counterterror police about his investigative work for us. Really high quality work, obviously, if they're doing that. Alex Rubinstein, who's responsible for some of our best deep dive pieces and is just doing hard work for us every week. And we've
Alex,
been
for
able
example,
to.
Alex, for example, broke the story that this was my personal favorite, that Jon Stewart awarded Ukrainian neo-Nazis at some military conference or event in Florida.
Yeah, exactly. And Kurt Metzger always references that like nonstop every time Jon Stewart comes up, but he never credits Alex. So we want to reward Alex for that. And I mean, it was completely Alex's idea to cover that event. He watched every minute of this event so that because he knew something crazy was going to happen, and it did. Then we got Wyatt Reed, who was just last year had his hotel shelled in the Donbass, has done a lot of quality reporting for us, but he's already on a ad hoc basis as editor and correspondent for us. And, without him, it would be really hard for me to get a lot of these long form pieces out the door so quickly. So we're going to be asking on our next stream for help to bring them on a long-term basis, and just think about what we could do with that all-star team. I think we could take the Grayzone to the next level. So I just wanted to get that out there. And I think we're ready to move on to the next order of business, which is more about Project Ukraine unraveling. I mean, this war to me, Aaron, and I know you've I think you agree, this war to me was supposed to be sort of the final piece in Project Ukraine, establishing it kind of as a big Israel in the region, an anti-Russia that would be strong enough to continue weakening Russia, as the RAND Corp called for in its 2019 paper, as Victoria Nuland called for in her 2020 Council on Foreign Relations article, and the constant expansion of NATO to Russia's borders until Russia is eventually balkanized and broken down. And it started with all the corruption around Maidan, and it seems to be a house of cards that's collapsing right before our eyes. So we're seeing Ukraine getting sold out on the international stage, most recently at Vilnius at the latest NATO summit.
Yeah. So the whole reason we were told, or a big reason we were told that we had to defend Ukraine is because we have to defend Ukraine's right to theoretically join NATO, and that it's an open door policy and Russia can't dictate to Ukraine what military alliances it can join or not. Then it came time for this NATO summit in Lithuania recently, a few weeks ago, and the US blocked any effort to not only admit Ukraine into NATO, but also even give it a roadmap and say, this is what you have to do to join NATO. They wouldn't even set up the conditions for Ukraine to join NATO. And this was a huge sellout to Ukraine. But it wasn't surprising, given that the US doesn't care about Ukraine and its well-being. It doesn't even care really about Ukraine joining NATO. It just cares about using the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO to bleed Russia and to use that future promise as a way to build up Ukraine into a de facto NATO proxy without the obligation for the US to defend it if it actually comes under attack. And so what we're getting from the Biden administration is just these complete lies to make it appear as if everything is going great for Ukraine and that Russia has already lost. So here, for example, is Secretary of State Antony Blinken just a few days ago.
In terms of what Russia sought to achieve, what Putin sought to achieve, they've already failed. They've already lost. The objective was to erase Ukraine from the map, to eliminate its independence, its sovereignty, subsume it into Russia. That failed a long time ago. Now Ukraine is in a battle to get back more of the land that Russia seized from it. It's already taken back about 50% of what was initially seized. Now they're in a very hard fight to take back more. These are still relatively early days of the counteroffensive. It is tough. The Russians have put in place strong defenses, but I'm convinced that with the equipment and support they've received now from more than 50 countries, with the training that their forces have gotten, and many of the forces who've gotten that training have not yet been put fully into this fight, and maybe more than anything else, with the fact that, unlike the Russians, the Ukrainians are fighting for their land, for their future, for their country, for their freedom. I think that is the decisive element, and that's going to play out. But it will not play out over the next week or two. We're still looking, I think, at several months.
So a lot there for Blinken. We're looking at several months more of war. He starts out with a lie, saying that Russia's goal was to subsume Ukraine, to erase it from the map. If that was the case, why didn't Russia do what the U.S. does when it invades places like Iraq, which is bomb the capital immediately, take out basic infrastructure, bomb the presidential palace, do all the things that you do when you actually are trying to overthrow a government? Russia didn't do that because Russia's goal was not to colonize Ukraine. They could not have colonized Ukraine with the forces that they sent in.
40,000. They sent in like 40,000.
Yeah, I mean, it's insane. The whole point
Ukraine
was
is the second largest army in Europe.
Yeah, exactly. The whole point was to basically coerce Ukraine into going to the negotiating table to accept the terms that it had previously pretty much agreed to, especially with the Minsk Accords, but refused to implement. That was the goal of Russia's invasion. And that's why you had peace talks from the start. As soon as Russia came in, there were meetings between Ukrainians and Russians. And there was, which Blinken omits and is no corporate news outlet will ever mention, there was a peace agreement reached in early April 2022, which the West sabotaged, which you can't talk about yet in establishment media because it undermines all the propaganda that Blinken just put out. But there he is saying that the war is, that Ukraine has a good chance of winning. But meanwhile, as Blinken was saying all this, he's contradicted by his own Pentagon. So this is John Kirchhofer of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. That's the Pentagon's intelligence wing. Traditionally, that's the most honest intelligence wing of the U.S. government that I've seen. That the DIA, for example, is the agency that produced that memo during the Obama administration saying that the Syrian opposition that the U.S. was supporting was dominated by Al-Qaeda and other sectarian death squads. That was from the DIA. So here is this top DI official giving us a much more honest appraisal of how the war is going.
We are at a bit of a stalemate. We do see incremental gains by Ukraine as they commit to this counteroffensive over the summer, but we haven't seen anything to really help them break through, for example, to drive to the Crimea. It's interesting to me, we tend to focus on some of the munitions that the West provides to Ukraine as they fight this out. And we look at some of them as holy grails as they play out. So if you think of HIMARS, certainly that led to some sensational tactical events. And then you see the Storm Shadow missile doing the same thing. And now we're talking about dual purpose, improved conventional munitions or cluster bombs. None of these, unfortunately, are the holy grail that Ukraine is looking for that I think will allow them in the near term to break through. Certainly, we are at a bit.
Seem to have lost the buzzsaw, Aaron Mate. He's coming back.
My bad.
And yeah. And so those comments right there, and we keep hearing this from we see concessions by Western media on the front page. For example, Washington Post, New York Times had the same front page piece about the failure of the counteroffensive, quoting Valery Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian chief of staff, on all his needs and how soldiers are actually having to, quote unquote, liberate minefields, crawling across it by hand because they can't bring armor forward in the Zaporozhye region. We saw the Telegraph, UK Telegraph, declare in a headline that the West is facing a devastating defeat in Ukraine. But we were calling this out, Aaron, before the counteroffensive even began, that it wasn't going to work. It's all based on delusions, if not something more cynical and sinister. And here's the question based on this Wall Street Journal piece that came out just a few days ago. Ukraine's lack of weaponry and training risks stalemate in fight with Russia. Yeah, it risks that. That's a real understatement. And I don't have the subscription here.
I can show it.
Here, look, this is all that matters. This is all you need to know. The first line, when Ukraine, and this is written from Brussels, so that's who they're talking to. When Ukraine launched its big counteroffensive this spring, Western military officials knew Kiev didn't have all the training or weapons, from shells to warplanes, that it needed to dislodge Russian forces. So they knew it wasn't going to work. What did they think was going to happen? That Russian forces were just so demoralized they just run away?
Well, let me show you the whole quote because it's so funny. I mean, it's funny,
it's not funny in a really dark, disgusting way.
Yeah, it's actually tragic. I take that back. It's tragic. When Ukraine launched its big counteroffensive this spring, Western officials knew Kiev didn't have all the training or weapons it needed to dislodge Russian forces, but they hoped Ukrainian courage and resourcefulness would carry the day. They haven't. So
thoughts and prayers.
Yeah, it's basically thoughts and prayers. And what we hope basically is that your courage and resourcefulness will carry the day. What that means is we hope you're going to sacrifice even more of your people in the hopes that might possibly bleed some more Russians. That's what it's all about. It's so easy to hope for someone else to have courage when it requires no courage on your part because you're sitting thousands of miles away in Washington or London. But that's the attitude. Yeah, we know we haven't given you what you need, but good luck. Thoughts and prayers.
Yeah, and thoughts and prayers at NATO as well. I don't know what Zelensky was thinking, that he would be given NATO membership, but he was essentially told not only that will he not be a NATO member, but Ben Wallace, the British defense minister, who's somehow no longer a defense minister, said, what do you think? We're an Amazon service and you can just order weapons and we'll just deliver it right away. It was a great comment because this is what they've been saying in private. And Jake Sullivan, NSC director for Biden, slapped Zelensky down and said, you're being obnoxious. This is disrespectful because Zelensky yelled at them. But they created this monster. It's like when you have a stray puppy in the street and you pet it and give it some food, it's going to keep showing up at your door and asking for more food, because if it doesn't get the food, it's going to die. But this is worse than a stray puppy, because it's a stray puppy that's been thrown into a dog fight by a cynical owner.
Yeah. Let me read you this, Max, from the David Ignatius of the Washington Post, who's very close to U.S. officials. This is what he writes. This is just as callous. Meanwhile, for the U.S. and its NATO allies, these 18 months of war have been a strategic windfall at relatively low cost. Parenthetical, other than for the Ukrainians.
And the Ukrainians, it's perfect. The Ukrainians are a parenthetical, like the Ukrainian people.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Other than for the Ukrainians.
See, this is the stuff I missed when I was on the road. You were plugging away. I mean, that's so sick. It is so sick. Well, the year of offense seems to be over. Ukraine is on the defensive now in Odessa. I don't know, they're being softened up for a Russian offensive. That could really be a death blow to the whole NATO project here if Russia manages to close off the Black Sea. I have no idea if that's even possible, and build a land bridge to Transnistria. I mean, that's a wrap. And there could be murmurings of some kind of rump state in Ukraine gaining NATO membership in exchange for Russia getting the Donbass and the ports, if that happens. But I don't know what does the Biden administration have next here? They're losing also. I mean, they keep pushing Ukraine to fight around Bakhmut still, and they're not gaining any ground. They're dying there.
Yeah, what they have next is maybe F-16s. But
yeah,
will that make a difference when Russia has, as far as I understand, pretty sophisticated air defenses? I doubt it, but that seems to be the only playbook. It just keep putting in more weapon systems and hope that Ukrainian courage and resourcefulness, which means Ukrainian willingness to sacrifice its people, that pays off.
Well, I mean, we're hearing a very different perspective from Biden, who cured cancer, I hear.
Oh yeah, right. Did he brag it recently, but he cured cancer? I didn't see the clip, but that was.
Yeah. I mean, I think he also invent the internet.
Yeah.
Well, here's Joe Biden on defeating Putin.
The answer is Putin's already lost the war. Putin has a real problem. How does he move from here? What does he do? And so the idea that there's going to be what vehicle is used, he could end the war tomorrow. He could just say, I'm out. But what agreement is ultimately reached depends upon Putin and what he decides to do. But there is no possibility of him winning the war in Ukraine.
He's already lost the war. I mean, this is
okay.
And also all negotiations depend on him, as though the United States isn't the other adversary. I watched that whole press conference. It was like a complete Potemkin press conference. Like I think only one Finnish reporter got to ask a question. Biden didn't like it. And then, CNN and one other tool who were just asking him complete softball questions. And still Biden manages to say something that shows that he's either being protected by his National Security Council and, the Newlandites in the State Department from the reality on the ground, or he's just simply lying.
Yeah. And when he talks about how only, Putin could end the war by leaving, what Russia has been demanding since before the war, before they invaded, were terms that either the U.S. has previously officially accepted or have been accepted by top level U.S. officials. So, for example, the Minsk Accords, that was endorsed by the U.S. Russia was asking that Ukraine implement that. Russia was also asking that Ukraine commit to neutrality and not to join NATO. Now, that's something the U.S. government never formally pledged, but so many top officials like George Kennan, William Perry, have all said was a reasonable position, because it's fair to not have a hostile military alliance expand to Ukraine, given Ukraine's historic ties to Russia and the millions of ethnic Russians who live there. That's what William Burns, by the CIA director, warned about in his famous memo, Niet means Niet, back when he was the ambassador to Russia. Russia was also asking for some sort of agreement on the placement of intermediate range missiles. And that was previously agreed to by the U.S. under the INF Treaty until Trump pulled out of that treaty during his administration. And Democrats looked away because they were more concerned with calling Trump a Russian asset than in protecting this vital nuclear arms control treaty. So Russia's terms are not radical. They should at least be discussed at minimum. But to date, the U.S. has refused to discuss them. And as long as that happens, we're just going to be in this perpetual war. And I mean, I imagine the hawks inside the Biden administration, which pretty much all of them, I'm not even sure if any doves exist anymore. I think they just want a frozen conflict where nothing gets resolved, and you have basically Ukraine turned into this permanent Israel, constantly at war and constantly being used as an outpost of U.S. hegemony. And that's the best outcome they can come up with. But again, the cost will continue to be borne by Ukrainians. And look, just one more example of the contempt U.S. officials have for Ukrainian lives. This is from the New York Times recently. Senior U.S. officials in recent weeks have privately expressed frustration that some Ukrainian commanders, exasperated at the slow pace of the initial assault and fearing increased casualties among their ranks, have reverted to old habits rather than sticking with the Western tactics and pressing harder to breach the Russian defenses. So in short, U.S. officials are frustrated that Ukraine fears casualties among its own people. So because Ukraine doesn't want to sacrifice its own people, we are frustrated by that, and we're willing to express that frustration.
And then they always say Putin is Soviet and Putin doesn't care about losing lots of soldiers. He doesn't care about life. And now they're saying that the Soviet tactics are kind of hanging back behind artillery, doing trench warfare. You can take the Ruski out of those Ukrainians. You can't take whatever it was.
I'm sorry to laugh. I'm sorry to laugh. It's so.
I mean, it's not. Yeah. So the Western tactics are like small unit detachments, combined arms, all of the stuff they preached that they got so much success on early on in the war when Russia wasn't dug in and had its armor exposed outside of Kiev in this fake Battle of Stalingrad that the Western media concocted. And they think they can just keep going with that and just slam into Russian lines. But the armor isn't even working anymore that was sent to them. The German Leopard has been a complete failure. The Bradley's been a complete failure. Like, why don't they ask Ukrainians what they think about the Western advisors now? And if maybe they would be doing better with their tactics, at least from a military point of view, or maybe they shouldn't have listened to them all along. Anyway, strategic windfall for the West. And strategic windfall, Zelensky is privatizing more Ukrainian companies and bringing in more Western investment, opening up the country to BlackRock. It's a strategic windfall. This is what Zelensky started doing immediately after coming into office. This is the point of Zelensky. This is the point of this war. And this is what, it all goes back to what we started out this stream by talking about, the Biden family corruption in Ukraine. So I think we're ready to move to our final segment, if you are.
Yes, I am.
Good. Well, I was very, I would say I was excited by the presence of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in the presidential race, not because I endorse him as a candidate, not because I was going to go work for him or something like that I would ever do anything like that, but just because he was providing a platform within the race, a high-level platform for many of the things that we've been saying. And he's someone who listens to us, who's had us on his podcast. And, I am doing this not just because I think that journalism is so inherently great, but because I see it as a means to an end. And in this case, the end should be the end of this proxy war before it turns into a hot war. And so I saw him as a positive force on that account. I liked some of the things he had said about the lockdowns, about criticizing the mandates. And so I thought it was refreshing to have him there. Now, Bobby Kennedy Jr., after being kind of sold out by a New York Post reporter at an off-the-record event where he made some convoluted and unusual remarks about genetically targeted bioweapons, about COVID being potentially genetically targeted. I think he was like referencing 2 studies. He wasn't necessarily saying what he was accused of saying, but he was accused of saying that Ashkenazi Jews are less susceptible to COVID, which, you know, maybe that explained my whole like fearlessness in the wake of this devastating anthrax-like virus. But that he was accused of saying caused the inevitable allegations of anti-Semitism, which, if you're a coward, you will take as the death blow to your political campaign or anything you do, and it will force you to overcompensate. That's kind of how the U.S. propaganda model operates.
Yeah.
You know, with Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, he didn't necessarily overcompensate. He just didn't push back hard enough. What RFK has decided to do, and I don't even know if he's decided to do it, it sort of seems like it's been arranged for him, is to attach himself to some of the biggest fanatics and grifters and financial scammers of the Likudnik wing of the Israel lobby, and to make Israel and his support for Israel a centerpiece of this campaign, which was supposed to be a piece opposing censorship, fighting for free speech, and taking on big pharma and corporate, unregulated corporations. And now he's just caught up in this Israel thing, as if that somehow will take away all these bad faith allegations about anti-Semitism from the Democrats. And I had to question, and I raised this question on Twitter, if some billionaire like Miriam Adelson, who has inherited the fortune of her late husband, Sheldon Adelson, is dumping money into pro-RFK super PACs to make this whole thing happen. So yesterday, RFK was on stage with Shmuley Boteach, this race-hustling, fake rabbi, reality show rabbi, at an event to make the case for Israel. That was, by the way, the title of an Alan Dershowitz book. And Shmuley Boteach's entire career is paid for by the Adelson family. So it really raises some questions, and it's definitely a major blow in my eyes to RFK Jr.'s credibility. If you want to show a clip.
What
do you think about what's happening, Aaron? I mean,
look, on top of just basic morality, like he's defending an apartheid government in Israel, defending a government that's been occupying, brutalizing Palestinians for decades, and is still doing it every day. But just politically, it doesn't make any sense to me. It's not as if the Israel lobby will ever support him. They already have both establishment wings of the Democrats and the Republicans captured, so they would never endorse him. And then you look at the state of the Democratic Party today, where he's running in, and the base is no longer fanatically pro-Israel. There's a lot more criticism among younger people of Israel today. And I would imagine someone like Kennedy, who has been, heterodox on all these, on some really important issues, especially Ukraine, would be going after the base of the party, especially young people. But yet, so taking this fanatically pro-Israel stance, which you have to say is actually, it's to the right of Joe Biden on Israel, right? So whenever now he gets accused of anti-Semitism, he says he'll pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. And yes, Biden has not renewed the Iran nuclear deal, but he's never said that he would like permanently kill it, which is what he's doing in practice. But he's never said that. So RFK Jr. is articulating something that Biden won't even say, even if Biden is, in fairness, doing it in practice. And he's also, recycling all these smears against people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, accusing them of being anti-Semites and basically defending himself by going after them. So, for example, here he is on Twitter. He's going after Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who accused him of being anti-Semitic for his comments about COVID. So he says, Debbie Wasserman Schultz has not only refused to condemn the overt anti-Semitic rhetoric of Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, but she supported Omar's appointment to the Foreign Relations Committee, despite Omar's advocacy of a boycott of Israel. So he's sounding.
And then there's this, and then he calls in this. This is the sleazy part. Omar used that platform to issue regular libels against Israel and Jews that include reference to Jews and their Benjamins.
Yes, yes, yes. Which was exactly correct what she said when she said it's all about the Benjamins, baby, and talking about the role of AIPAC. That was absolutely correct.
Well, and RFK appears to be proving that point. I mean,
Yeah.
and if he, because here's the question: if he believes all this, then where's the record of his fanatical Israel support before? And why would he welcome me on his show or engage in any personal relationship with me? Like, I've had private discussions with him and he's been very friendly to me. And I felt like we had a real tete-a-tete. Like, I felt like he was someone who gets it. We talked a lot about USAID and his work on that. You know, it was like, he's like someone who is a core in like our core base of intellectual support in the gray zone. And suddenly he sounds just like a hack here, like a Republican hack, attacking the Democrats with the sleaze tactics that the Democrats use against him.
There's no way he didn't know. I mean, I'm presuming this, but I think it's fair to say there's no way he didn't know that you wrote the book Goliath, one of the definitive books about Israel as an apartheid state, published in the U.S. in recent years. There's no way he didn't know that. I'm sure he's very familiar with all the work you've done about Israel and Palestine. And so, yeah, this is just shocking. And Dennis Kucinich is his campaign manager. And when Dennis Kucinich was in Congress, he was one of the rare consistent voices in support of Palestinian rights. And where is he on this too? It's a real mystery. And there's an irony to both, you know, Kennedy and also him, the people he's now attacking, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, is that they're on some issues, they're so solid, but yet on other issues, they take the positions of the neocons they claim to oppose. So in the case of Kennedy, he's taking the side of the neocons and going after Ilhan Omar for being, you know, pro-Palestinian. But yet these same people go after him because he's on the right side, I think, when it comes to the Ukraine proxy war. And same thing with Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. Staunch advocacy for Palestine, at least in terms of what's possible inside Congress. They could be better, but still, in terms of the spectrum there is, they're better than everybody else. But yet when it comes to the Ukraine proxy war, they're in lockstep with neocons as well. So it's impossible. The lesson here for me is, if you're inside the Democratic Party, at least right now, it's impossible to be consistent, to have consistent values. You have to pander to somebody. In the case of Bobby Jr., pandering to the pro-Israel lobby and people like Shmuley Boteach. In the case of the Squad, pandering to neocons when it comes to the Ukraine proxy war.
Okay, well, let's look at this from a slightly different angle. So there were a lot of protests at the Shmuley event yesterday, and here's one of them, which I think further suggests that this is not, you know, this is not a principled stand that RFK Jr. is taking, because what's he being? She's saying, "Why are you lying?
We're doing a job.
Why are you lying about the killing of RFK Jr.? Why are you lying?"
Thank you.
And then she sits down. So she's saying, "Why are you lying about Sirhan killing Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s father?" Sirhan was a Palestinian. The official story is that he killed RFK Sr. because as senator, he voted to send a major arms package to Israel. And Shmuley from the stage blames Sirhan to implicate all Palestinians. So, whoever's putting the starred stuff on screen could please stop, because we've already done the starred.
Oh, okay, my bad. That was me.
Oh, okay.
That's bad.
We already ran through that.
Okay.
But thank you all for your support. Thank you all for the super chats and for all the really positive comments. We get our share of negative comments, so we really appreciate it. Okay, you can
I will
hide
do
your
that.
comment.
Yes.
All right, so I've spoken to Bobby personally about this. He's been very open, very passionate about this. He doesn't believe Sirhan was some lone gunman, some nutcase who killed his father. This is very personal to him. He believes that an intelligence-linked pro-war ring killed his father to stop him from ending the Vietnam War and from implementing all sorts of progressive policies across the board in the United States, that they were probably funded by private enterprise. He doesn't believe Sirhan did it. Whatever you think about the assassination of RFK Sr., it doesn't matter. That's what RFK Jr. believes. And he's sitting there like a hostage on stage while Shmuley says something that he believes is a complete lie. And so one of RFK's supporters is there, and she just can't take it anymore, rises up from the audience and accuses Shmuley of lying. Jeremy Lafredo, who is a contributor to the Grayzone, was at the event. He told me that RFK just would be sitting there. He'd say something, and then Shmuley would speak over him and start correcting him about what the actual correct take was supposed to be. Jeremy tweeted something really interesting from the event, which shows that like RFK doesn't really know the basics of the issue, because you're not supposed to say this. He was asked about Israel's secret nuclear arsenal, which the United States protects and protects the IAEA from, prevents the IAEA from inspecting at its secret weapons facility in Dimona.
Israel's use of a nuclear weapon is not going to happen unless it's attacked. And we know that.
So he says Israel's use of a nuclear weapon is not going to happen unless it's attacked, leaving aside the veracity of that statement or whether that statement is true. He's acknowledging that Israel has a secret nuclear arsenal. Now, if you're running for president, you're not, and you think you're some serious candidate, you're not allowed to say that. No, Helen Thomas, you know, she was the AP reporter who would always sit in the front row and be the one reporter that would ask hardball questions of presidents. She would always ask the president or his press secretary what if they would acknowledge Israel's nuclear arsenal, and they would always refuse to, abiding by Israel's policy of strategic ambiguity. So RFK doesn't even know that, and then Shmuley comes in and corrects him. I mean, it shows to me that he's walked into something that he doesn't even understand. And I think this will not destroy his campaign. It just compromises it heavily, shows that he can be corruptible. And from our point of view, it's a really depressing thing to watch.
It is really depressing because I really valued what he was saying, especially about Ukraine, and he was getting it out to an audience that otherwise wouldn't hear it. He was getting attention, and the polls reflected that there was discontent inside the Democratic Party. People are frustrated with Joe Biden for so many obvious reasons, and he tapped into that. And on this issue, which, you know, both you and I have been so involved in for so long, and it's such a just a basic issue, it's like there's no controversy over whether or not you support apartheid in South Africa. And likewise, there should be no controversy over apartheid in Israel, which in fact is arguably, in fact, it is worse than apartheid South Africa. What Israel does to Palestinians. You can't make that declaration. So it's just, unfortunately, for all the good that Bobby Jr. has done, he's totally compromising, I think, his entire message here. And this is our way of voicing our concern about that. And I personally would be happy.
He could have just sidelined it, put it in the icebox, said some boilerplate too, and said, you know, I want to focus on these urgent issues. He could have done that. He's not doing that. He's making it central to his campaign. I want to address 2 points that more hardcore RFK supporters, who also are, you know, Grayzone viewers, have made to me. One is that the Israel lobby is so powerful that he needs to do this in order to get them off his back. So that why does he have to get them off his back? This whole campaign is going to be rigged against him. He's not going to. It would be some kind of. The DNC will not allow him to win primaries and start making a run for the Democratic nomination. They will not allow it. They'll break the law. They'll do anything to stop that. They will stop it. So why not go for broke if he actually knows better? So that point is invalid. And then number 2, they say that he's going to weaken U.S. empire. So we have to just kind of take the L on this one, on Israel-Palestine. Israel is the core of U.S. empire. Israel is the unsinkable aircraft carrier of U.S. empire in the Middle East. Israel is constantly lobbying for the U.S. to attack Iran. So if you're against the Ukraine proxy war, how can you support the main mechanism for triggering war against Iran, which would be a regional war, and which is already attacking Syria on a weekly basis, attacking Damascus, attacked Homs, attacking deep into Syria? It's a war state. And that leaves aside the moral question of the Palestinians. But those 2 points are invalid. I don't think there is any basis for defending what he's doing here. It raises deep structural core issues about the integrity of his campaign and about himself as a candidate. And I look forward to challenging him to his face on that. He's avoided interviewing with us for obvious reasons. And I look forward to challenging Dennis Kucinich. I don't know how he can explain this. His silence.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I say this as someone with deep admiration for Dennis Kucinich, for all that he's done. Invaluable person with really unparalleled courage as a U.S. politician. There's no one like him. So he hasn't said anything. It's not like he's publicly endorsed Bobby Jr.'s claims about Israel, but he has sat there as Robert Jr. has been making them. And I hope he speaks out. And maybe we'll have the chance even to speak to someone from the campaign and voice our concerns on a personal level. But I think it's just important to call this out because it's so depraved for obvious reasons.
So, yeah, I got to meet Dennis for the first time at the Rage Against the War Machine rally. He gave a great speech about the Nord Stream pipelines, but he put his reputation on the line and several presidential races to take on the Israel lobby. So where is he? And it's not just up to us. It's up to everyone to challenge the candidates on this issue while they're still out there and not just hiding like Joe Biden is and did during the 2020 election in his basement. RFK's out there. Ask him questions about this. And I really hope that this is just a bad decision he's made based on him trying to, I don't know, impersonate his uncle Teddy Kennedy's campaign against Jimmy Carter when he went super ultra Zionist, and that it isn't being paid for. These opinions aren't bought and paid for by the Adelson family or some other Likudnik oligarch who like insulates the wall of his McMansion with bulk bought Alan Dershowitz books. Like, I really hope that's the case. But it's depressing. And just kind of one more, final element to this campaign discussion is the presence of Cornel West, who is sticking to his guns on Palestine, stuck to his guns in an interview with Anderson Cooper, who told him it's inappropriate to compare Russian invasion of Ukraine to the U.S. invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, and also Russia's military operations in Chechnya. He was offended that Cornel West could draw some kind of equivalence, when in fact in Iraq, the U.S. killed much more people, and unlike Chechnya, that was an invasion of a country, far away from the U.S., whereas this was anyway. But yeah, Anderson Cooper was like choked up that Cornel West could dare suggest that the U.S. Killed civilians and is and acted illegally inside Iraq.
See, if I had been in Cornel's chair, I would have reminded Anderson Cooper that Bill Clinton compared Boris Yeltsin to Abraham Lincoln for his actions in Chechnya. Because it was a breakaway. It was an attempt at balkanizing Russia the same way the Civil War was about balkanizing the U.S. Bill Clinton openly said that.
Yeah.
And that was before Chechnya had become infested with jihadist elements that were actually attacking inside Russian cities, carrying out terrorist attacks. So it was more inappropriate then. But the point is that Cornel West is there. He's not in the Democratic Party, which makes him actually a greater threat from the point of view of the DNC to Joe Biden's reelection attempts, because he really will peel off. They think this is what they think. It's not true. He'll peel off left-wing votes that should be just people voting against another Trump administration and holding their nose for Biden, when in fact those people never would have voted for Biden. It's a protest vote. But they're terrified of Cornel West. There was an article actually in CNN where the Democrats have started belly aching about Cornel West, and they're wondering what to do with him. And they're starting to call him crazy. As long as he's there and he's just simply out there on the ballot, he's a threat. And here's what I had to say about this, which is that the Democrats are plotting to bribe Cornel West. That's what they're going to try to this, because I know how they work. They'll get some donor to come in to some university. I mean, Cornel West has had his career so badly tainted and abused by people like Larry Summers, who's close to Biden, got rid of him at Harvard. And he's at the Union Theological Seminary, but they think that they can play to his vanity. They'll get some big donor. I don't know. George Soros gave $150 million to Leo Botstein at Bard College, Epstein associate Leo Botstein. So they can do that and then say, well, all you got to do is just install Cornel West as dean or as like the head of this major department. I mean, I have no evidence that they're doing that. It's just something I think they would try to do. And then if Cornel West says, no, I can't be bought, that's not, the prophetic tradition, then they're just going to call him a Russian asset, demonize him, and they'll go do what they did to Matthew Ho in North Carolina, who was running as a Green Party candidate, and go to people's homes who signed to get him on the ballot and ask them to retract their signature. They'll go one by one to people. They'll do that. That's classic voter suppression that the DNC has already attempted. Democracy.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful to Cornel West for sticking to his guns and staying principled. The one critique of him that emerged from that Anderson Cooper interview is that he made this all about NATO expansion, the whole war in Russia. It's not just about that. There's also the Maidan coup in 2014, the refusal to implement the Minsk Accords afterwards, and also the placement of offensive U.S. weaponry around Russia, especially in Poland and Romania, where these so-called anti-ballistic missile, these missile defense sites can be easily repurposed to attack Russia. And those were the issues Russia tried to address before it invaded. And those issues, until they are addressed, will continue to fuel war. And I hope Cornel West is aware of all that, because it's not just about NATO expansion. But anyway, he did push back on Anderson Cooper. And it's always amazing when you see someone in public life who sticks to principle. And Cornel West exemplifies that. So I wish I could combine
him with RFK a little bit, because RFK speaks in bullet points. He deploys data and studies, and Cornel he uses a lot of rhetoric that's a little too vague for me.
He's a jazz man.
He's a jazz man. He's playing scales, but we could use some math rock here.
rare endorsement of math rock. Yes.
That's the only endorsement I'll offer. Thanks everyone for being with us today, and I think we'll pick up steam and come back more frequently. As I said, I've been on the road, but I'm in a more solid, undisclosed location now. And as I also mentioned, we're gonna launch a fundraiser so that we can bring on a long-term basis Kit Clarenberg, Alex Rubenstein, and Wyatt Reed. We want the dream team. These are some of the most talented people I've had the privilege of working with, and I'm going to need your help just to raise a modest sum so we can reward their dedication. So look out for that. And I don't know, anything else you want to add?
Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And remember to like the stream and support the Grayzone. And we'll see you next time.
Peace.
Peace.